All right, ready to dive deep into some research today?
Let's do it.
Specifically, we're looking at international business research
Ooh, excited.
and how to make it impactful, how to make it something that people actually want to read.
And use.
Exactly, and use, yeah.
Yes.
So to guide us on this journey, we have a great article from the Journal of International Business Studies, GIBS,
Yes, it's a good one.
by a Guinness,
That's a Guinness. Okay.
Taher and Melina Azorin.
And they're giving us basically the methodological must-dos for impactful IB research.
Yeah, the must-dos.
Ooh, I like that. Methodological must-dos. Okay, I'm taking notes.
You should be taking notes.
So, like, what's the big takeaway here? What are we looking at? Should I bring out my highlighters?
I think the core idea is that researchers really need to focus on using robust research methods before they even start collecting data.
Okay, so get the foundation right.
Yeah, get it right from the get-go.
Okay, but back up a bit. What are they saying about the current state of IB research? Well, they point out this thing called the research practice gap, which is basically this disconnect between what academics are researching and then what managers and policymakers actually need.
So like what we're learning in the ivory tower isn't actually what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. And what people need to know to make decisions.
Like they're solving the wrong puzzle, basically.
Yes, exactly.
So how do we fix it? How do we bridge that gap?
Well, the authors suggest something called the design science approach, which is kind of a mouthful. But
Yeah.
basically, it's about thinking like a designer who's trying to create a better future rather than a scientist who's just observing what already exists.
So less like passive observation and more creating something new.
Yes, exactly.
I like that.
Yeah, so for example, instead of just studying, say, the general relationship between cultural differences and business performance, researchers could use this approach to figure out how to attract global talent or design, a really killer foreign market entry strategy.
It's less about the what is
Mm.
and more how can we make it better?
Exactly. Yeah, things that have a real impact.
Yeah. Less theory, more application.
Absolutely. And it's not just about relevance. The authors also go into detail about the need for real, meaningful, theoretical progress as well.
Okay, so we're not throwing theory out
Let's-
completely.
No, we still need theory,
Okay, good.
but it's got to be good theory.
Okay, well, let's talk about that. Let's talk theory.
Okay.
What are they saying about, like, pushing the boundaries of what we know?
Well, they point out that a lot of research kind of gets bogged down in hypotheses that are way too vague.
Ooh, too vague. Okay.
Yes. So they use the example of like a study on the relationship between women on boards and corporate social performance.
Okay. Yeah.
And they say just saying there's a positive correlation, is interesting, but it doesn't really tell you very much.
Right. Yeah.
It's kind of like saying like going outside makes you feel better.
Right. Yeah, but like, in what way? How much better?
Exactly. There are so many details missing.
Yeah, it's giving very much blurry photograph.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so vague hypotheses are out. How do we
Yeah.
make them, I guess, more specific?
Well, they recommend being much more granular. So instead of just saying more women on boards leads to better corporate social performance,
Right.
you could specify something like a 10% increase in female board representation will lead to a 5% increase in corporate social performance, and this relationship will be linear.
Ooh, so really specific numbers.
Yes, exactly.
And relationships. Okay.
It's so much more precise.
Yeah, that's like switching to a high-definition camera.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, and then we can actually test it properly.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay. Well, speaking of testing, they also talk about proving causality, right?
Yes, they do.
It's not enough to just say that two things are related.
It's true.
We need to be able to say that one causes the other.
You do.
Like, how do we tackle that? Because I imagine that is very difficult, especially in international business,
It's so challenging.
because there's so many factors, right?
Yeah.
It's very complex.
It is. It's like trying to untangle a giant knot.
Right, exactly.
The gold standard, of course, is a randomized experiment.
All right, of course.
But those can be so hard to pull off in the real world, especially when you're dealing with multinational companies.
Right, and complex global issues.
Oh, yeah.
So what do we do?
Well, they suggest things like quasi-experiments where you try to control for as many variables as possible, even though you can't do that random assignment.
Right.
Or using some fancy statistical techniques like latent class analysis, which helps you identify different groups or patterns in the data. They even talk about this procedure called the ITCV procedure.
But what?
ITCV procedure,
Okay.
which helps you assess the risk of omitted variable bias, which is like,
Oh, okay, so like those sneaky variables you didn't even know were there.
Yeah, Yes, exactly. The ones that are messing with your results.
Yeah, the hidden gremlins.
Yes.
Okay. So we've talked about relevance, theoretical progress, causality. Is there anything else that we need to think about when it
Oh.
comes to impactful research?
Yeah, so they bring up this concept that I think is so insightful
Okay.
called the three horns of research,
Three horns of research.
which is basically about recognizing that every research design has its limitations.
Okay, so no perfect study.
No perfect study.
Right.
You can't maximize everything at once. It's
Okay.
kind of like trying to juggle chainsaws and bowling balls and flaming torches.
Oh, all at the same time. Okay.
Somebody's got to give.
Okay, so what are these horns? Fill me in.
So the three horns are generalizability,
Okay.
precision,
Okay.
and realism.
So you can only pick two.
Yeah, you can't have a study that's super generalizable, super precise, and super realistic.
Okay, because that would be the perfect study.
That'd be the perfect study.
But it doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist.
All right.
It's a trade-off.
Okay.
So let's say, for example, you are studying the impact of cultural differences on negotiation outcomes.
Okay, yeah.
You could do a lab experiment
Right.
with tons of control,
Okay.
which would give you amazing precision. But, lab settings, not exactly known for their realism.
Not super realistic, no.
No, on the other hand, you could go out and survey hundreds of international negotiators.
Right.
Super realistic. But you lose some of that precision
Yeah.
because you can't control for every variable.
It's almost like picking between a laser pointer and a floodlight,
Oh, I like that.
where the laser is very precise, very focused, but only on a tiny little spot,
Yes.
whereas the floodlight is wider,
Yes.
but less intense.
I love that analogy.
So how do you decide which horn to prioritize?
It all depends on what you're trying to achieve
Right.
and your research questions, but really the author's advice is just to embrace those trade-offs,
Okay.
acknowledge the limitations of your design, and consider using multiple methods, what they call triangulation, to kind of compensate for each other's weaknesses.
Okay, so like using multiple compasses to make sure you're going in the right direction.
Exactly.
Get a really robust understanding.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, speaking of different approaches,
Yes.
the authors also talk about something called mixed methods,
Yes. Very important.
which I'm super interested in. So this is like blending qualitative and quantitative approaches.
You got it.
Okay, but here's the thing. According to the authors, the vast majority of IB research still relies very heavily on those quantitative methods.
It's true. Numbers, numbers, numbers.
Yeah, everyone just loves crunching data, doing the regressions.
It's true. They do.
Why do you think that is? Is it just like, seen as the gold standard?
Yeah, I think quantitative research has this air of being more scientific and objective.
Right, okay.
But the authors really make a strong case for mixed methods, especially when you're tackling those big, messy, real-world problems.
The ones that keep CEOs up at night.
Exactly.
So instead of just having a hammer, we've got a multi-tool now.
Yes, exactly. You can tackle different problems with different tools.
Yeah. Okay, so give me an example of how this might play out.
Okay, so let's say you're researching globalization and labor practices in developing countries.
Okay, big topic.
Yeah, so you could analyze mountains of data on wages and working conditions and trade flows.
The quantitative side.
Yes, exactly. But to really get a sense of the human impact,
Right.
you need to talk to workers, hear their stories, see their lives.
Right, that qualitative side.
Exactly.
Okay.
So by combining those two perspectives, you get a much deeper understanding.
It's like the difference between reading a travel brochure and actually going to a place.
Ooh, that's good.
Yeah, the brochure gives you the facts,
Yeah,
but the lived experience is what makes it memorable.
exactly.
So, speaking of getting a good understanding,
Yes.
the last challenge that the authors highlight is about constructs and measures, right?
Right, making sure what you're measuring is actually reflecting the concept you're interested in.
Which, it sounds obvious,
It does.
but I bet it's trickier than it seems.
It is. It's so easy to fall into that trap of using convenient measures that don't actually capture the essence of what you're studying.
Right, like trying to measure intelligence by looking at someone's shoe size.
Okay. Yes, exactly. Totally irrelevant.
Completely useless.
And I think this is especially tricky in international business research.
Oh, I bet, with all the different cultures and contexts.
Oh, yeah. The
Yeah.
meanings of things can get really slippery.
It's very fluid.
It is.
Okay, so how do you even begin to measure something when the meaning is so fluid?
Well, that's the challenge.
Ah.
And they bring up this concept called distal proxy fallacy,
Distal proxy fallacy.
which is basically, when the things that you're measuring are so far removed from the concept
Okay.
that the findings become unreliable.
Okay, so like trying to measure a whale by looking at its shadow.
Exactly.
You're getting a distorted view.
Yes, exactly.
So how do you avoid this fallacy?
Well, they recommend a pretty involved four-step process for developing clear construct definitions,
Okay.
which starts with, like, good old-fashioned dictionary definitions,
Okay.
and then reviewing all the research literature, and then talking to experts.
So really being thorough.
Being thorough, and even doing things like focus groups to get different perspectives.
So you're saying don't just jump right into collecting data.
Don't just jump right in.
Take some time. Actually define what it is you're looking for.
Yes,
Like having a treasure map and making sure the X is in the right spot,
exactly.
or you'll never find the treasure.
Exactly.
Speaking of measurement, they also talk about Cronbach's alpha.
Oh, yes, the good old Cronbach's alpha.
Isn't that kind of like the gold standard for checking if your measure is reliable?
It's very popular,
Yeah.
but the authors caution against overusing it,
Okay.
especially in international business research.
Okay, why is that?
Well, Cronbach's alpha makes certain assumptions about the data
Right.
that often don't hold up in these cross-cultural contexts.
So it's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Exactly.
Okay.
It just sometimes doesn't work.
Okay. So Cronbach's alpha is not the be-all, end-all.
It's not.
What are some of the alternatives that people can use?
So they point to some, fancy options like omega coefficients and coefficient H,
Fancy it. Yeah.
which are, don't worry about the technical details,
Right.
but they're often more robust and reliable.
Okay, and
that?
especially when you're dealing with cross-cultural data.
Exactly.
Okay, so be savvy with your tools.
Savvy.
Use the right tool for the job.
Exactly.
Don't try to hammer a nail with a screwdriver.
Don't do it.
Okay. Well, I think that brings us to the end of the article's methodological must-dos for impactful research.
It does.
Wow. Okay, that was a lot,
It was a lot.
but super fascinating.
It is.
I think it's really amazing how many things researchers have to consider to make sure that their work is both credible and impactful.
It's true they do.
Okay, so give it to me straight. What is the one thing that our listeners should take away from this deep dive?
I think it really boils down to this idea that impactful research isn't just about what you're studying,
Right.
but it's really about the how.
The how, okay.
How you do it, being thoughtful, rigorous in every step of the research process
Oh, at the beginning.
from the beginning.
To the end.
Yes.
Okay, it's like baking a cake.
Oh, I like that.
You can have the best ingredients,
You can't.
but if you don't follow the recipe
It's true.
and you don't use the right tools,
Yeah.
you're going to end up with a big mess.
Out of flop.
Exactly.
Disaster.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the research practice gap,
We did.
the three horns of research,
Yep.
mixed methods.
It's important.
But I'm wondering, how do all these methodological must-dos actually play out in different areas of international business?
Well,
Let's say we're looking at, for example, something like global corporate social responsibility.
okay.
What unique challenges might researchers face there?
Ooh, global CSR. Yeah, that's a hot topic these days.
It is.
But it's also kind of a minefield
Oh.
for researchers.
In what way?
I think one of the biggest challenges is just defining what it actually means for a company to be socially responsible on a global scale.
Right, because it can be different in every country.
Exactly. Different cultural norms, different legal systems, different stakeholder expectations.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. It's like trying to herd cats
Right.
all over the world.
So how do you even begin to measure something as complex and nuanced as global CSR?
That's the question, isn't it?
Right?
You have to be really, really careful about how you define and measure it.
So what are some of the things you need to consider?
Well, first you have to decide, what are you actually focusing on?
Okay.
Are you focusing on environmental sustainability
Look.
or labor practices or human rights or community engagement?
Great. So there's like different categories almost.
Yeah. And then how do you collect data that accurately reflects all these different dimensions
Right.
across all these different countries and contexts?
Right. Which is a lot.
It's a lot.
And then on top of that, you have the distal proxy fallacy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Making sure your measures are actually capturing the essence of what it means to be globally socially responsible.
Right. Not just something random.
Not something random.
Okay. So how do you make sure that you're measuring the right things?
I think that's where mixed methods can be incredibly valuable.
Okay, so bring back the multi-tool
Bring back the multi-tool.
instead of just the hammer.
Yes, you can have all this quantitative data
Right.
on things like, carbon emissions
Right.
or charitable giving
Right.
or diversity statistics, but then you also need to layer in that qualitative data.
Right. Get those stories
Those
from
stories.
interviews, focus groups.
Yeah, to really understand how the company is actually impacting people and the planet.
It's like the difference between looking at a map versus actually exploring the terrain.
Yes,
The map gives you a basic overview,
it does.
but to really understand it, you need to get out there and experience it.
Love that analogy.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into international business research, what is your final word of advice for all of the aspiring researchers out there?
Ooh, my final word of advice.
Yeah, what should they take to heart?
I would say don't be afraid to be bold, be creative, and be a little bit messy.
Okay, a little messy, I like that.
Challenge the status quo, question your assumptions,
Okay.
embrace, methodological
On
pluralism,
the tools.
use all the tools, and never stop learning. Research is an adventure.
It is.
And the most exciting discoveries often happen when you kind of venture off that beaten path.
Love that. Well, to all of our listeners out there, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.
Keep diving.
And who knows, maybe you'll be the ones writing the articles that inspire future deep dives.
That's what we like to hear.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into impactful research. Until next time, happy diving.